Since the end of 2007, Rob Cameron is the Chief Executive Officer of the Fairtrade Labeling Organization, the umbrella organization that unites all sorts of fair trade initiatives in more than 20 countries around the world. This involves millions of producers and workers across the world. Fairtrade Labeling Organization exists now for 13 years. The prime aims of this organization are to develop and review the fair trade standards, to improve the impact of those standards, and to make the case for trade justice in debates on trade and development. Fairtrade Labeling Organization, or as it is called, FLOW, more popularly speaking, does this in partnership with other international fair trade organizations, companies and governments. Before becoming a CEO of FLOW, Cameron was the CEO and executive chairman of the international communications company FLAG Communications. He has also become one of the UK Prince of Wales's ambassadors for corporate responsibility and is member of a number of think tanks on responsibility for more than a decade. Now he heads FLOW for almost or more than 3 years. It's a period of sustained and rapid growth, despite or maybe because of the financial crisis. He initiated in 2008 a strengthen, broaden, deepen campaign that basically aims at better certification practices, more products, for instance Fairtrade Gold is one of the new products, alliances with more retailers, scaling up our activities and working in an increasing number of partnerships. So we're happy to have Rob Cameron here on the occasion of the Max Havelaar lecture of this year, where we take stock of the issue of power and responsibilities. And I would be very interested to know Rob's angle on this issue. So welcome Rob here. The first question I want to ask you is, of course, why are we here?
Or better put, why aren't I here today as you look at this this recording? Yes, I will be in Dubai, and I'm in Dubai seeing some people with a view to the possibility of expanding fair trade. We're looking to expand fair trade in many territories around the world. The Middle East is one, and as you look at this, I'm spending my time with one or two of the actors in the Middle East that just could well help us in that cause. So yes, that's why I'm not here today.
Is there any market for free? This is the next question for me. Is there any market for free trade in the Middle East at the moment?
Well, there's certainly a market for free trade. Whether there's a market for fair trade is another matter. But let's find out. I'll tell you when I get back.
But it's not yet. There's no. Is there any share of fair trade?
What's really interesting about the Middle East is that particularly the Saudis are starting to look at the whole concept of corporate responsibility, and what they're recognizing is that they need to look at how they're engaging in the broader corporate responsibility conversation, and certainly through accountability, the think tank accountability with which I'm associated. There's been quite a lot of work done to understand how the corporate responsibility agenda can be looked at in the context of the Middle East and how Middle Eastern companies should respond.
Thanks also for, in any case, giving us the opportunity to talk with you on what I would call, maybe for today, the power of free trade and the power of the labeling organization that you represent. In the position paper, I've been looking at a number of dimensions of power, so it might be a good idea to go through some of them and give you an opportunity to respond to that. On the one hand, we have the power of size. So my question to you would be, how big is the fair trade organization and the fair trade idea?
Well, the idea is huge, and the idea starts with a very simple premise. Why don't we invest in the developing world so that producers have a chance to fulfill their potential? That's the basic idea that we start off with. Now, in terms of size, we now have some 3.4 billion euros of retail sales, of products sold in some 58 countries, I believe is the number now in which the products are sold, sourced from many countries across the global south. So in terms of size, you could certainly say for what began as a niche idea and a niche organisation, we are now registering on the global scale. But let's be clear, in total terms, in terms of total trade across the world, fair trade is still relatively small, and we have a long way to go before we could consider ourselves to have really arrived on the global trade scene to the extent that I believe we're capable of doing.
Which you also think you should.
Well, I think the ideal thing would be that fair trade wouldn't be needed in the first place. But since, as we know at the moment, there are many, many people in the developing world that are growing the commodities that we take for granted that don't have a decent opportunity, actually we are needed, and we will be needed for the foreseeable future as far as I can see.
Okay. Let's go into another dimension of power, where you have a lot of powerful actors in society. This is the power of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Who owns fair trade?
This is one of the great beauties of fair trade for me, in that, in one sense, it's actually quite hard to figure out who does own fair trade. My organisation, effectively, is an umbrella organisation, an association. We have 21 national labelling initiatives, such as Max Havelaar Netherlands, or the UK Fair Trade Foundation, or Transfer Germany, to name but three. Those are members of our association, so those are the market-facing operations. And then we also have three members that represent producers. So we have the Central Latin American producers, the African Fair Trade Network, and the Network of Asian Fair Trade Producers. And they're co-owners themselves. So in fact, fair trade truly is a social movement that connects consumers, many of whom are members of the national labelling initiatives, and producers who are represented through the three producer networks. And they constitute the owners of fair trade.
A social network sounds nice. Social networks also involves power battles, debates, discussion, conflicts of interest.
Yep.
How do you deal with that?
Well, no one ever said multi-stakeholder collaboration was easy. It isn't easy. Actually, it's really rather hard. But what you need to have are the mechanisms in order to find resolutions whereby you focus on the things that you are aligned around, and then maybe we agree on 80% of things across fair trade and 20% of things are different. But we don't want to focus too much always on the differences, because actually that's what often happens in multi-stakeholder collaborations, and you can see that across many other walks of civil society life. I think what's really interesting for me in fair trade, though, is the fact that unlike just about any other organisation of its type, this true producer participation, something that I think we could do even more with, but producer participation is the key.
Let's get into the third dimension of power. That is the power of position. You aim at consumers. Retailers aim at consumers. Big brands around the world, the Unilevers of this world, aim at consumers.
Yes.
Where do you stand in this? And there is, of course, in the position paper it's also explained that there is a considerable battle for the channel and for markets going on between, in particular, retailers and the A brands. Are you not fearing that you will become cannon fodder in that battle?
I think the way I look at it is that if we want to drive change, then we need to work with the levers of change. And to my mind, big business constitutes a lever of change. We've done a lot in fair trade. Let's not forget, we've done a lot in fair trade working with what you might call the alternative trade movement. We've seen extraordinary successes in the alternative trade movement. So, if you think about organisations like Divine Chocolate, or you think about Cafe Direct, or you think about Gaper, these are alternative trade organisations that have actually done really well with their own mission, and they've done well within the fair trade family. But I think that if we really want to make an impact on the world, and if we really want to change consumer behaviour, then we're going to have to work with big brands too. Now, we need to figure out how we do that so that we're influencing their behaviour, listening to what they have to contribute as well, and ensuring that we're not co-opted in the process. And I think the diversity of fair trade's ownership puts up some fairly good mechanisms for ensuring that we're not co-opted by business. I've a really, I think what's fascinating for me is that over the course of fair trade's existence, the way in which the business agenda has changed, and your paper identifies that the business agenda has moved on. And I think for me, it's a really important part of the journey in sustainable development that business has moved from, well, I'm not sure if we really want to be part of this, to actually embracing this as part of their own agenda and seeing the business self-interest of sustainability. That's a really good development, but what we want to make sure is that that self-interest isn't just becoming a self-interest for the brand and the brand exclusively. It has to have broader societal impact than simply benefiting a business's bottom line.
Okay, let's get then to the fifth dimension. Because partly I hear your answer and I say that sounds very elaborate and rational, but the reality is of course very irrational. Branding, labels, it's in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
Power battles are not fought just on the chain but also on the image.
Yeah.
So the fifth dimension of power that is also distinguished is the power of framing and agenda setting. Now big companies are very strong there, and they can set an agenda also that is not in your interest, for instance, or not in the sustainability interest. Now in the paper we look at that and say, what is the story behind that, or the business case?
Yeah.
Could you say something on, say, the story you tell on the Fairtrade initiative, on the solutions you present, and do you have a good story, meaning a sophisticated story where you're able also to identify the dilemmas and the trade-offs that you're facing?
There's a lot wrapped up in that question. Let's see if we can take that apart a little bit. So firstly, in terms of the basic premise and basic story of Fairtrade, as I said earlier on, it has a strong redistributive element of extracting some value in monetary terms from the developed world and investing it in the South. But that's not the whole story. There's a lot more in the way of the what I would call the benefits of fair trade from the producer perspective, and I think that's what we've got to keep uppermost in mind. It's not just about brands, it's not just about consumers, very strongly oriented to benefits to producers, and that's something we might want to explore in a little more detail.
Would you call that empowerment?
Do you know, I think empowerment's a really loaded word.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's useful. The word empowerment is useful in, I think we all implicitly know what we mean. But let's be clear. It is not, in my view, possible to empower somebody else. What we can do is to create the conditions in which they can empower themselves. There's nothing empowering about giving empowerment to someone. In fact, you could argue it's a complete impossibility to go and empower somebody else because, you know, logically it doesn't make sense. What we have to do is create the conditions in which producers empower themselves. And part of how we do that is through things like the minimum price and the premium. But there are other ways in which we empower producers. So access to information, organisation. These are the sorts of things that can make a real difference to producers. Access to market, access to technical assistance, capital and credit. These are all producer benefits that are part of our, you know, what we're trying to do here when you talk about agenda setting, you know, that's very much a part of the framing of our agenda. So we provide economic instruments, but other benefits to producers that lead to empowerment. We've seen over decades, centuries in fact, is that free trade doesn't exist, and it's one of the reasons the failures of so-called free trade is one of the reasons why a market-based mechanism like fair trade came into existence in the first place. Now, in terms of agenda setting, I think we have done a really good job in fair trade of agenda setting. And I think though what we need to do now is continue pushing the debate and pushing the agenda. But what I'm interested in is not just agenda setting. I'm interested in helping deliver results. Now, I think that the world is moving in that direction too in terms of its relationship with NGOs. There was a recent survey by Accenture into CEOs and of global corporations and their view of sustainability. What's interesting is how many of those CEOs see sustainability as essential to their business, and that wouldn't have happened 5 or 10 years ago, but also where they see NGOs. And where they see NGOs is moving from agenda setters down to delivery partners. Yep. And I think that's where we've got a role to play, because what we can do is help businesses put their values into practice and help businesses build sustainable supply chain by investing in those supply chains so that producers are benefiting and have more sustainable livelihoods.
But you have a problem. There is the CEOs of the world said a year ago, well, sustainability might be important, but in particular the ecological sustainability. Climate change seems to be more important than poverty. And of course now with the financial crisis, our own welfare seems to be much more important than the others' welfare. So how do you, is this a struggle or is this an opportunity?
No, well I think of course it's a struggle. I mean things like the global financial crisis and climate change are huge struggles. But let's be clear. Firstly, the global financial crisis has disproportionately affected the poor in the developing world. When the crisis began with the original credit crunch, access to capital and credit dried up. Now there is capital and credit available for developing world producers, but on pretty poor terms, it has to be said, where it is available, and that's causing problems. And the financial crisis continues and will continue. It will continue to cause problems for producers. Now, talk about climate, let's be clear, climate is not merely an environmental issue. Climate change is a social issue, it's a health issue, it's an economics issue, it's an issue that affects all aspects of life. And in that context, you know, we know that producers are already in the South who are those least likely to have made an impact on climate in the first place, are disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change already. Only yesterday, I was speaking to someone just back from a tea producer who sees the desert encroaching upon their tea estates. And they're putting in mitigation now to try and arrest those impacts. So, you know, we need to have things to offer to producers through our partnerships and through things like the Fairtrade Premium, so that they can invest in things like water management, irrigation, and in terms of drought-resistant crops and so on, so that they're better able to respond to climate change, because it is really going to affect them badly and already is doing so.
I had a number of points to make that I think also portray some of the criticism also towards your organization or the way you have organized it. So maybe if you indulge me on this, that we can talk a little bit on this. For instance, there is the criticism on the effectiveness. Others are more productive. Other labeling initiatives have a different business model, different business case. You go for the poorest producers in relatively distant regions. How do you look at this criticism?
Well, I think the comparative nature of the kind of studies that you're talking about, you know, very often, you know, it's a bit like saying, well, it's all fruit, and then you start comparing apples with oranges. You know, I think that, yeah, of course, it's all ethical certification and labeling, but we are focusing on slightly different things. So making some kind of empirical judgment based on this piece of research or that piece of research, you know, for every piece of research I've seen that says fair trade is this or that, I can find you a piece of research that says it's better than this or that.
But have you come across any serious research that did a good job in comparing those initiatives?
No, I think what I'd like to focus on more is fair trade making a good impact for the people that are participating in it, rather than saying it's better than this or better than that. Because
so
you know,
how would you like to do that?
Pardon?
How would you like to do that? Because that's another type of criticism that you find in the organization. That is, you didn't do a zero measurement. There is no sort of idea where you came from and what progress is made and where you want to go to.
Yeah.
Or is that an old criticism?
Oh, I don't know if it's an old criticism. I mean, I think that, you know, firstly, you've got to look at it in the context of global trade. International trade, global trade as we presently understand it, has been going on for some 250 years or so, and we've been in existence, as you pointed out earlier on, for 13 years. So, you know, as the Chinese would say of Christianity, is it a really major religion? It's too early to tell. So, you know, I think that sometimes we forget the youthfulness of fair trade and the problems that we're addressing. Just go back to what I said earlier on, I'm much more interested in developing more empirical research that shows fair trade and the progress that producers have made, but I'm also interested in the kind of specific examples. And anybody that visits fair trade certified producers finds pretty much a similar story, that producers are enjoying substantial and demonstrable benefits from the engagement with fair trade. And you know, I see it again and again, every producer I go and visit. Yes, there are criticisms, yes, there are problems, and no, we don't have a perfect system. And yes, we really must engage in a program of continual improvement. We are not done with these standards and certification, but anybody who goes and visits fair trade certified producers sees the benefit with their own eyes. Yes, and I think the Indian context is really very interesting from a number of points of view. Firstly, there's a growing consumer base in India. Secondly, there's some very, very poor producers in India that are selling their produce in the developed world. We've got a lot of room for expansion there. One of the ways in which we can do that is what you might call south-to-south trade. So Indian products sold on fair trade terms in Indian markets. And that's going to demand that we are looking at things very much in local context. So in the same way as there's a version of fair trade that we may need to deploy for the Middle East, similarly we may need to look at it in a different way in India, and I think we need to be open to those sorts of differences. Another example of that is what we're doing in South Africa. So here in South Africa we already have South African products sold on fair trade terms to South African consumers. And it's going to happen in Kenya any minute now. You know, these are the sorts of developments that I think are bring more opportunities for producers, but they're also going to require that we reassess the model of fair trade so that it works well in that local context, rather than simply saying, well, this is how it worked in the Netherlands, so therefore we can transfer it across to India, China, Middle East.
Last topic, science.
Yes.
We are here at the Research Institute. What would be your short list of most important research questions to ask and hopefully to get some answers to for your organization?
I think there's two areas most probably. Firstly, longitudinal research on the impact of fair trade that does, you know, we can't look at what we didn't look at 15 years ago, but if you start now, in 5 years' time we might have some really solid longitudinal research, and I think there's a real role for institutions like yours in that kind of area. Secondly, I think you mentioned the word framing earlier on, and I'm really interested in the directions in which consumers are framing the sustainability agenda and in which business is framing the sustainability agenda. And we can't do enough looking at trends and the directions in which this thing is going in, because you know I think the wind of change has moved and is in our favour, but that wind of change could prove to be fickle, and we need to understand where it's going, both so we can respond to consumer interest and business need, and also influence the direction in which it's going. And I think that the institutions like yours are a very useful, if I may say, weather forecaster of the direction in which the wind may be blowing.
You are a very optimistic person. Certainly the way you present yourself and your organization and the challenges. That of course appeals very much to a business audience, for instance, because businesses look at not at threats but at opportunities. When will this opportunity of fair trade become either a reality or such a gloomy picture that we just stop trying to do this and we just go on with our lives and not be interested in fairness anymore?
Are you looking for a date?
Please.
Okay.
We have investor communities there as well. They want to speculate on this as well.
Well, of course, and no, it's not by next Tuesday. No, I think that I don't think we can put a date on it, but I think that there is a tipping point in the big products that we work in. Now, if you look in the UK, look at bananas, you know, we're moving to a position now where the majority of supermarket sales of bananas are fair trade. We've seen that happen similarly with other products in other parts of the world. What we need is for the big five, the big six products, coffee, tea, cotton, cocoa, bananas, sugar, for those products to be registering above 10% universally on global sales. And that's when we're at some kind of tipping point, I think, where fair trade starts to become the norm. Yeah. What we also need to do, I think, is get to a place where we are, if you like, a global trust mark, that people see the mark and they recognize what it stands for and they're willing to buy because they understand what it's there for. And I don't think we can quite say yet we are that global trust mark. Yeah. And to get there, we need to be supported by, if not the world's most effective, one of the world's most effective citizens' movements. And I think that lies behind so much of what fair trade does. And by citizens, I mean consumers, but I also mean producers, and indeed I'd even include business in that. Now, when will that happen? Well, I'd like to think that our work will be done and we don't need to exist anymore within my lifetime. But, you know, I may be an optimist, but I'm not sure that I'm that much of an optimist. There's still plenty of work for us to do yet.
Well, I certainly hope you will be proven right, because it's the same. We share the same lifetime.
Well,
so I would really love to see that happen.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank you for this conversation, and let's see what we can do about this.
good. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.